drinking wine and beer all the week. Time for whiskey on a Sunday.
Well, hello everyone. You are all very welcome indeed to join me for this installment of my online series, Whiskey on a Sunday, with me, Somm4All. And whether you're watching this live here on Instagram at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on a Sunday night, or if you're catching this on replay via my Somm4All IGTV channel, my Somm4All Facebook page, Somm4All Twitter feed, or Somm4All YouTube channel, I want you all to know that I sincerely appreciate your interest and your time. This said, if you are, however, not of legal age to purchase and or consume alcohol where you live, I need for you to now say goodbye. For everyone else, I encourage you to pour out a wee one, sit back as we trek off to Scotland. So Ireland on the brain for so long. So with that in mind, with the first few weeks of this online series, I did indeed focus on Ireland and on the deep Irish history with whiskey. And to me, that made perfect sense as the Irish pretty much invented whiskey. Well, the monks in Ireland around 1200 AD are believed to be the first ones to distill, but you can learn more about that in episode 1, which is available across all of my social media feeds. Now, after several weeks of talking about Irish whiskey, as you just saw, still on the brain. So after several weeks of talking about Irish whiskey and of tasting 8 different offerings, I'm moving on to a land barely more than a stone's throw from the coast of the Emerald Isle. We're off to Scotland, who themselves have a very rich whiskey history. And no, this does not mean I'm done with Irish whiskeys, as we've just witnessed. There's still a ton to talk about and taste, and over the coming weeks and months, Irish whiskies will absolutely work their way back into the format. But for now, back to the Scots. It's often said that Scotland started distilling very shortly after Ireland did. No surprise there really, as the same monks who first started distilling barley in Ireland, they were thought to have continued their travels and to continue to move around and are believed to have visited Scotland themselves. And in doing so, likely no doubt brought their distilling knowledge with them. So you may be wondering, Paul, when exactly then did Scotland start distilling whiskey? If you've asked that, excellent question. Well done, gold star for you. The answer, though, is a little less than exact, however. While there are claims of whiskey distillation in the 13th century, the first written record of whiskey production in Scotland dates back to 1494, where in the Scottish Exchequer rolls, there's a record of a local lord who had asked for provisions to be made to secure malt for a friar to turn that into aquavitae, which another term for ishke baha, essentially whiskey. So, we got to go back to 1494 to that first written record as the first written proof that it was being done. So, still, that's just over 500 years worth of proof that Scotland's been making some form of whiskey. That's pretty good heritage in my opinion. So whiskey production really started to thrive in Scotland in the mid to late 1600s, but it was given a shock to the system and production when in 1707, following the death of Queen Elizabeth, Scotland's own James VI, who was her cousin, was crowned king. And this created the Acts of Union, which essentially meant that Scotland and England were now merged, and it subsequently, resulted in huge taxes being placed on whiskey. A further, let's call it blow to the Scottish whiskey enterprise came about in 1725 when the English crown enacted a tax on malted barley, and while the Irish got creative with their response to this, again, see early episodes of Whiskey on a Sunday to learn more, the results for the Scots was that distilleries either closed or that distillation itself was forced underground. And by this, I mean almost literally underground. Distillation was said to have taken place under altars, inside coffins, really anywhere that the distiller thought, that would help them avoid the taxman finding them. Out in the country, in the rural settings, the folks out there, mainly farmers, they had a different approach. They elected to try and distill under the cover of darkness. at night. When smoke from the fires that were being used to boil the base for whiskey production, that smoke under the cover of darkness would be almost impossible to see and make it very, very difficult for the tacksmen to try and trace where the fire was coming from. It's also believed that this is how and where the term moonshine came from. I mean, these folks were literally distilling by the light of the moon. So there you go, another fun fact for you. So in Scotland, illegal distillation continued to grow, and between 1725 and 1800, it's believed that pretty much half of all whiskey distilled in Scotland was done illegally. It didn't stay that way for long, though, as in 1823, the Duke of Gordon introduced a new legislation piece that would allow for whiskey to be produced and sold legally anywhere in the United Kingdom by those people that paid a £10 license fee, £10 at the time, it was a lot of money, but anyone that paid that £10 license fee and also who set a per gallon fee for their whiskey produced was allowed to do so legally. I mean, this pretty much snuffed out all the illegal distilling, and it really helped turn Scottish whisky into a thriving industry. And it's one that still continues to this very day, doing very well. Another boon to Scottish whisky came about in 1831 with the invention of a very different type of still that could be used with grains, such as corn and wheat, to produce a base alcohol. So before that, it was pot stills and they were using barley, but with the invention of this, they could now use grains, like I said, like corn and wheat. So this still was originally invented by Robert Stein, and then it was tweaked and let's call it perfected and then patented by Aeneas Coffey. And this new still could run continuously. That factor alone made it massively more efficient than traditional pot stills. And, using a very low cost grains as well. So those grains cost a lot less than malted barley. So very important factors there. And while this still was first showcased to the Irish distillers, the Irish, they took a pass on it. They didn't like it. They preferred to stay with the tried and true method for making their whiskey. The Scots, though, they were quick to jump on board with this new still, choosing to mix the grain spirit that the new still made. They mixed that with pot still spirit that was still being made, and that produced a very light and less intense flavored whiskey. And it was also extremely cheaper to make than Irish whiskey. So folks, the whiskey enthusiasts in the UK, they not only loved that there was a new lower price for whiskey, but they were also very pleased with the new taste and that lighter profile that the Scottish were creating with the advent of that new still. And not only did folks like it, things just kept getting better for the Scots. In 1846, the UK repealed grain import laws, which allowed Scottish distillers to get a hold of an abundant supply of very cheap French and very cheap American corn. Although, truth be told, those corn shipments from France and from America were actually destined to help feed the starving and dying Irish during the Great Famine, but somehow the Scots got a hold of it, and most of it anyways, and I digress. So they had all that corn. They were armed with a very cost-effective production method, that abundance of a cheap material, and a light-tasting product that really seemed to appeal more and more to people each day. Scottish whisky was now finally able to tackle the popularity of Irish whisky head-on, and boy oh boy, they most certainly did tackle Irish whisky. Prohibition in the U.S., more modern times, the 20th century, Prohibition in the U.S. saw Irish whiskey channels closed, but Scottish whiskey was actively still being snuck into the country, into the U.S. Joe Kennedy was one of the people that was choosing Scottish whiskey over Irish whiskey. Ha ha ha. Ireland's civil war in the early 20th century also hurt Ireland's own domestic industry, but really it had zero effect on Scotland, of course, and the Scotch just kept on going. Much like that little rabbit with the sunglasses and the batteries that we see on TV today. They just kept going and going and going. And despite some economic downturn in the 1980s, which resulted in a lot of consolidation amongst Scottish distillers, for example, today Diageo alone owns brands like Johnny Walker, Benrinnes, Blair Athol, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of consolidation. But aside from all that, Scottish whisky still continues to be extremely popular worldwide, and for many enthusiasts, it's the preferred whisky style, period. For my first Scottish whisky, on Whiskey on a Sunday, I thought there was only one place, whoop, that's the dog. There's only one place in Scotland that I had to start, and that's the island of Islay. And it's not Islay, it's actually called Islay. Now this area is thought to be amongst the very first in Scotland to distill whiskey. Again, not a real surprise given that Islay lies a mere 16 miles off the north coast of Ireland. Now for those of you familiar with the north of Ireland, 16 miles from Ballycastle lies the coast of Islay. Coincidentally, Ballycastle is not very far from Coleraine, which is the home to Bushmills. Ireland's self-proclaimed oldest distillery. Well, kind of. Anywho, so for early distilling on Islay, they weren't far off the coast of Ireland, but their approach was much different than what their Irish neighbors were doing. Islay's signature style then, and mostly now, is that of peated whiskey. Although, truth be told, there are a few distillers that offer a non-peated whiskey in Islay, but most of them it's peated. Back in the early days, Islay whiskies were also pretty much distilled right out in the open in what were called back then black shebeens. That's what we would refer to today as essentially an unlicensed bar. So they were just free willy-nilly producing this stuff. Within Islay sits the home to today's tasting, Bowmore. And folks, yes, I have it on very good authority that the correct pronunciation is indeed Bowmore, not Bowmore, Bowmore. Founded in 1779, it is indeed the oldest distillery on Islay and amongst the oldest in all of Scotland. Over its history, it's had several ownership changes and has been a part of the Suntory Group since 1994. Little fun fact for the Canadians watching, its second owners, the Mutter brothers, promoted it in 1852 as an export whiskey, and it reached countries very far away and very exotic places like Canada back in 1852. So, little fun tie there. Now, despite ever-changing owners, the distillery itself has maintained some very interesting features. The walls of one of its warehouses acts as a seawall, helping to defend the area from the thrashing waves that spring off Loch Indel and preventing flooding in the local area. The distillery also had and continues to maintain its own floor malting, with up to 40% of its needs being met this way. So what this means essentially is that after the raw barley has been soaked in water for 27 hours, that's what they do at Bowmore, they soak it for 27 hours, they then take that wet barley where germination is starting and they spread it out over a floor on site, and the barley is then dried from heat from fires underneath the floor. And at Bowmore, they throw a little peat in there. Now the barley is hand turned every 4 hours without fail. That's one of the unique attributes of Bowmore. They do this manually without fail to keep the germination of the barley slow and constant throughout the whole process. And to me, that shows a great sign of commitment to quality production by the folks at Bowmore. Oh, when I mentioned peat, yes, for the first 18 hours of the drawing process, peat is indeed added to the fires. And that, thereby helps to create some of Bowmore's more unique and aroma and flavor profiles that it has. Some other neat facts about Bowmore? Well, there's several cottages available on site for rent, so you can actually stay on site. Oh, and waste heat, so excess heat from the production cycle, that's used to heat a massive public swimming pool housed in a former Bowmore warehouse right near the distillery. So some cool things there. And while Bowmore uses hand-turned malted barley, floor malted barley, they use peat, they use quality water from the River Lagan, and they also use a variety of different age casks to mature the whiskey. Perhaps the most influential factor is a natural one, and that's the climate of where it's located. Islay sea air and the crashing waves, they combine to create an almost microclimate type of environment around and actually inside the distillery itself. In a way, they say that's part of the magic of Bowmore. Okay, all right. Now, I've been talking a lot and I can hear you literally shouting at your phones, your tablets, your laptops. You're saying, Paul, all this info is fascinating and everything, but come on, man. What about the whiskey? Right. So I've kept you all long enough. What about the whiskey indeed? Well, let's find out, shall we? So, this is Bowmore's 12-year-old single malt, which means, who knows? Hands up if you know what it means when it says 12-year single malt. Anyone? Anyone? Well, kudos if you know that the age statement of 12, right here on the bottle, that means that the youngest whiskey used is at least 12 years old. And single malt, well, in Scotland, single malt means that it's produced at one distillery. It's made from 100% barley. It's made using a pot still, so not that new column still like we talked before. This is made in those traditional pot stills. And that it's matured and bonded at a warehouse. So if you knew all that, well done. Okay, 40% ABV. Bright, pale with a coppery color to it. That coloring agent that I've talked about in other episodes, E150A, that's definitely in here. But again, that's not important, but just to say that it's in here. Again, most distilleries use E150A to some degree. So, okay, now if you do have Bowmore 12 at home and you're following along with me, whether live or on the replay, I'm going to suggest a 3-stage approach to nosing the whiskey. So, the first step is we kind of just bring it up. We kind of say hi. Then we take it away. Then we go in again, kind of saying, how do you do? And then the third one, we're just saying, lovely to meet you. And the reason for that is we're just trying to acclimatize your nose so for free to get ready to really smell it. Okay, so now we're going to go in. For those of you that have one, cheers, take a sniff. Well, there's the peat. But it's a fairly mild intensity. I don't find this overpowering at all. The peatiness, that savory, that smokiness, it's not going to send anyone to the hospital or anything like that. I get savory campfire smoke, getting sea salt, it's the sea, kind of smelling of the sea. There's definitely some citrus in there, some lemon, some orange, maybe orange rind. Digging a little deeper, get some honey, cedar, whiff of vanilla from the casks. Almost say there's a little tropical in here as well. Maybe a touch of fresh mango and grilled pineapple, caramelized pineapple, just a touch. And then I get a bit of dried fruit, raisin, date, a little bit of toasty yolk, and just a little bit of brown sugar. Quite inviting on the nose. Now, for a taste. Good stuff. You always want to move it around, get all the flavor receptors firing. Okay. Light, loose, smooth, and approachable. All the things that I love and admire in a whiskey. Seriously though, salty, almost seaweedy, but in a good way. Soft, savory smoke. A little lemon peel, so some citrus in there, a little lemon peel. A little black tea. And almost a hint of some earthiness. Honey is starting to come through now. Yep, lots of good, solid notes of honey. Get maybe a little stone fruit. Some sweet herbs. Little dried, unsweetened coconut, so not the sweet stuff. And then just a little bit of bitter lemon at the back. Have a little taste. Little vanilla and just a little bit of chocolate. Overall, very nice. Very comforting to me. Very easy to drink. again, in my opinion, of course. But yeah. So how can you get it? Okay, well, here in Ontario, at the LCBO, stock number 330803, selling for, in my opinion, a very reasonable $62.95 for an aged whiskey. For the Quebecers, if there's any Quebecers watching, stock number 330803, the same number as the LCBO, funny enough. And in Quebec, it sells for $62 even. For any of my US friends and followers, I've seen it listed on websites in the States for anywhere between 60 to 65 USD, which is a little high in my opinion for the US, but nonetheless, again, it's aged, so we have to factor that in. This isn't stuff like like bar rail mix. Okay, so overall, what do I think? Well, truthfully, Somm4All likes it. I'll be honest, yes, there's certainly more refined whiskey offerings from Bowmore, but I think that for someone who's curious about Scottish whiskey, and more importantly, curious about peated whiskey, I think this may be a great choice to start with. The folks at Bowmore have been making it for hundreds of years. They know what they're doing. And in my opinion, the peat used is a very restrained and almost a moderate approach to using peat. I really don't think anyone's socks are going to go flying off when sniffing or tasting this. Well, at least hopefully not. So, yeah, I like it. So, folks, there you have it. Some background on Scottish whiskey itself, and a virtual guided tour of Bowmore and Bowmore 12. I do hope everyone's enjoyed this installment of Whiskey on a Sunday with me, Somm4All. Next week, I'll be back here live on Instagram at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to take a virtual walk with the man from Kilmarnock. That, of course, being Johnny Walker. Until then, thank you all. And in these continuously, let's call them interesting times, no matter where you are, please be safe, be well, and cheers from Somm4All.